So last year I made my first foray into the world of the Manosphere, and of the few videos that I made on the subject, I kept getting the same criticism. And that criticism was that simply I didn't know what I was talking about. And if you don't know me or my personal history or anything to do with the channel, then yeah, that can seem like a fair criticism. The purpose of this channel is to provide accurate and actually helpful self-improvement advice. And part of that is also looking at some of the ways that self-help actually does the opposite of what it kind of purports to do. Being a good self-improvement channel, in my opinion, isn't just about giving good self-improvement advice, it's also pointing out the bad, the toxic, the stuff that just simply doesn't work. And a lot of male focused self-improvement advice comes from the Manosphere, and I think that a lot of the foundations, a lot of the subjects that are kind of brought up in the Manosphere don't really help all that much. So that's what I'm going to be looking at over the coming weeks. You know, what is the Manosphere? What are the various parts of it? How does it work? What are the beliefs? What's the good? What's the bad? What's the stuff that's just kind of weird? And I wanted to start off with what is MGTOW, because it was the subject of some of my more popular videos on the Manosphere last year. What exactly is MGTOW? What are the beliefs? What do its followers kind of live by? What does it all mean? So what is MGTOW? Well, MGTOW stands for Men Going Their Own Way. Thank you very much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, blah, blah, blah. No, obviously there's a lot more that goes into MGTOW than just the acronym. So jokes aside, let's talk about this philosophy and really what it's all about. And we'll start where all good in-depth analysis begins, of course, with Wikipedia. And to be clear, these videos aren't just going to be me just dryly reciting the facts around the Manosphere and the theories and the evidence, because that would be pretty boring. I am going to be pushing back on certain stuff wherever I see the opportunity to do so, wherever something is not backed up by the evidence, by the facts, by kind of logic and reason. And that actually starts with the Wikipedia article itself, because I think the description of MGTOW within the Wikipedia article is not necessarily fair to the majority of followers. It says, MGTOW is an anti-feminist, misogynistic, mostly online community advocating for men to separate themselves from women and from a society which they believe has been corrupted by feminism. And whilst this might be an accurate description of what MGTOW kind of does a lot of the time, it's not necessarily an accurate description of what MGTOW is. And whilst there doesn't seem to be a broad consensus on the definition of what MGTOW is, what you'll find most people say is that it is simply a philosophy. It is a way for men to orient their lives. They believe that the world has become anti-man, that there are a lot of double standards both in law and society, and in a lot of other ways as well. They believe that men and boys are being unfairly targeted, and that the only way to escape these problems, the only way to avoid them, is to separate themselves from what they believe is the cause of those problems. I also have an issue with just branding everyone in MGTOW as an anti-feminist misogynist, because that might not necessarily be the case. I personally believe, and there is a lot of kind of anecdotal evidence to back this up, that a lot of people come to MGTOW when they are in times of pain, typically to do with some kind of relationship problem, a breakup, a divorce, a child custody battle. I don't believe that anyone is a natural anti-feminist in the same way that I don't believe that anyone is just like a natural socialist. The more extreme beliefs are radicalized in over time in the same way that it works with any socio-political group. For example, I didn't start off my life as an ultra-left socialist weirdo on the internet. No, my more extreme anti-capitalist beliefs were radicalized in over time. In its essence, MGTOW is a philosophy of separatism that comes with 4 distinct levels. Level 1 is coming to the understanding that men are being used and manipulated by women. This is often called situational awareness, and others simply call it the red pill. More on that in another video. It should be noted that at this stage, they may even still believe in the concept and value of marriage. Level 2. This is where men begin to reject long-term relationships, cohabitation, and marriage, though short-term relationships and hookups are still absolutely fine. Level 3. Now this is when you start to reject even short-term relationships and you avoid interaction with women as often as possible, and this leads to level 4. This is called going ghost, and it's the highest possible level of MGTOW. This is where you minimize your interactions with state and society on the whole. In essence, you drop off the grid as best you can. And needless to say, level 4 is the hardest level of MGTOW to reach. But I think that to fully understand MGTOW, you don't look at the level 4. I believe that it's necessary to look at level 1 and see kind of what the fundamentals are, what the core beliefs are, how it all gets started, and what happens from there. The fundamental belief of MGTOW is that society is imbalanced. It leans heavily towards favouring women over men. It also states that men are being manipulated and used for the benefit of women. And the often brought up example of why this is kind of ostensibly the case is that they will bring up the idea of hypergamy. Now, I think I did a pretty good job of describing the ideas around hypergamy and the evidence that actually backs it up in my video right up here. So go check that out if you can. For those of you who have made it this far who think that my take on hypergamy would be some ultra woke SJW cuck tier shit, I would encourage you to go and watch it because you'll probably find it a lot more charitable than that. But to kind of summarize what hypergamy is, it was initially coined in old Hindu law texts, and it pretty much described the practice of marrying up in terms of your caste. So you would always want to be marrying either in the caste that you already were, or marry into a higher caste, and marrying into a higher caste was of course preferable because it raised your social status, financial prospects, and pretty much just your quality of life in general. Applied to MGTOW, it simply describes the idea that women are inherently driven to seek higher status men, and they do this for their own benefit. And status in this case is mostly stripped down to money, power, sometimes good looks, genetic potential, if you will. Although I admit that this is by necessity an oversimplification of the beliefs around hypergamy by the MGTOW philosophy. So forgive me for that. Now, it turns out that hypergamy is actually a real thing. It is a very well studied sociological phenomenon that describes how women will typically marry into or get into relationships with men who earn more money than them. There's a lot of kind of lines that hypergamy can go down. Finances is just one of them. Education is another. Physical attractiveness is yet another, and it's all a lot more complicated than what I'm bringing up here. There's also a number of pretty good explanations for why hypergamy exists, but that's something that I go into in my hypergamy video, which once again I recommend you go and watch. But MGTOW takes it one step further in that they believe that women are innately driven to always be seeking higher status, more money, more power, more influence. They might say, for example, that a woman who is married to a man would happily divorce him and take as much of his money and resources as possible if the potential for a slightly higher status male appeared. Needless to say, it doesn't really paint a very positive picture of women and relationships and marriage and concepts such like that. But when I looked into it, I couldn't really find any evidence that demonstrates that when women end relationships, they typically tend to move on to somebody who is higher status, whether that is in terms of power or money, or whatever kind of line you want to take that down. But for the sake of a balanced argument, just because I couldn't find any evidence doesn't mean that there's any out there. So I would invite anyone from the MGTOW community, if you have that evidence, please present it to me so that I can properly analyze the claims. Though if that evidence was out there, I can only imagine that it would be plastered across every MGTOW blog, YouTube channel, forum, and subreddit possible, and you can make of that as you will. However, hypergamy is definitely one of the more central fears of the philosophy, and I use fear because it's kind of the only thing that kind of comes to mind. It's a very serious concern of the MGTOW philosophy, so much so that there is in some cases even a kind of tongue-in-cheek retconning of the definition of MGTOW to stand for men guarding their own wallets. And given the belief that all women are like that, which is another kind of central tenet of the philosophy, the only way to avoid these problems is to minimize your interaction with those you perceive as causing those problems in the first place. In this case, women, or kind of more broadly feminism or society. It just depends on kind of what your personal perspective is within the MGTOW community. If you should find yourself in a marriage or a long-term relationship, they say that you are opening yourself up to the possibility of what they term as divorce rape. Should you have children with a woman, then you are opening yourself up to be absolutely bodied by courts and custody battles. I'll go into both of these specific points in future videos, which I suppose is just a subtle reminder to subscribe to the channel, because I'm going to be exploring more of this stuff and debunking it where I can. The followers of MGTOW view their actions as akin to self-preservation. They also believe that society has become, or perhaps always was, gynocentric, which is to say that power, money, influence is disproportionately flowing towards the hands of feminists and women on the whole. This, along with some more right-leaning libertarian tendencies, leads to the final conclusion of MGTOW, which is that men should go ghost and separate themselves to the best of their ability from state and society. Although I point out again, this is something that very, very few members of the MGTOW community actually achieve. Now, before I start to criticize the MGTOW philosophy a little bit more harshly, it's important that I actually bring up some of the positive aspects of this group. For example, there is a very, very strong sense of brotherhood and community within the followers of this particular philosophy. And this is something that I actually highly encourage. It is important that men build strong connections with other men, because it's something that we really don't do, and it's leading to a bunch of other problems. In terms of their self-improvement advice, a lot of it is focused on living a more purposeful life, of finding your purpose and working towards it. Things like that are why I would group the Manosphere into the general self-improvement world, because there is this idea of men should be working towards their purpose. They should be trying to achieve something with their lives. I think this is important. I think it's something that men need to know. Like I said, I believe that a lot of people come to MGTOW when they are at a point of pain in their lives, when they're feeling confused, when they're feeling alone, and the broader community around MGTOW provides a sense of not being alone, that there are other people who have gone through what it is that you're going through right now, what it is that you have been through. It's important for men to find a community, to find a sense of belonging. But with that in mind, let's get into some of the criticisms of MGTOW. Now, obviously, I fully expect that if this video gets any kind of reach, that I am 100% going to get a lot of criticisms from people in the MGTOW community. So if you've got fair criticisms of what I've said, make sure to leave them in the comment section down below, and I'll do my best to respond to them as best as I can. Some of them I'll probably respond in future videos, but I will do my best. So let's start with the ideas of AWOLT, all women are like that, and hypergamy. Now, the MGTOW philosophy is very much based on this generalization that all women are naturally hypergamous manipulators of men, whether they know it or not. And whilst the concept of hypergamy is real, the actual scope of it is a little bit more complex than is presented most of the time. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But first, we have to talk about the hasty generalization fallacy. This is simply when you make a claim based on evidence which is simply too small. Essentially, it is the idea that you cannot, in good faith, accurately back up a claim if you only have one or two small bits of evidence for it. Or to put it in more kind of concrete statistical terms, if you don't have kind of a statistically significant amount of evidence for it. If you know where to look, and a lot of people in MGTOW seem to, there are hundreds, maybe even thousands of individual stories of women being massive pieces of shit, of women being horrible manipulators who are acting towards their own selfish ends. Women can manipulate and destroy men's lives. They can lie, cheat, steal, and do a whole bunch of other horrible stuff. This is something that they can do. This is something that some women do, in fact, do. However, just because I have found a few examples, or maybe even hundreds, or maybe even thousands of examples of individual women doing bad things, it would be a hasty generalization to assume that all women are like that. It would be fallacious reasoning. So let's flip the script on this a little bit. Let's say that you go to the bank. You've gone to get a loan and unfortunately you're refused. You just so happen to notice that the banker who you were dealing with is a man of Jewish faith, and you start to get suspicious. You go home and you do some research and you start to realize that this is something that's happened before. In fact, it's happened to quite a few people, a few dozen, a few hundred, maybe even a few thousand people who have had these kinds of negative experiences with Jewish bankers. Bearing in mind, I'm assuming that in this example, like me, that you're a white guy, it would be a hasty generalization for you to base off of your experience and the maybe dozens or hundreds or maybe thousands of stories you were to read on the internet, to assume that all Jewish bankers have it in for the white race. It would also be super anti-Semitic. Just because some women do awful, terrible things, it does not necessarily follow that all women are like that. But in the interest of fairness, I would like to compare the term AWOLT to a pretty similar term, ACAB. So all cops are bad, or all cops are bastards, depending on how polite you want to be at the time. ACAB doesn't mean that every individual police officer is a terrible person who wakes up in the morning and gleefully waits for the first minority to cross his path so that he can beat them with a truncheon. Rather, it is just simply something that describes how the criminal justice system is flawed and how it often has disproportionately bad outcomes for people who are minorities or for people who are poor. Now, this would not be a hasty generalization fallacy, because I wouldn't be drawing this conclusion from just examples of people who have had bad things happen to them. It is very politically and rhetorically effective to do so, but I've also got loads and loads of data and science and studies to back up the claim that the criminal justice system, for example in the UK and the US, is fundamentally flawed, maybe even broken irreparably. ACAB is a critique of the system, not of the individual. Now, let's apply that to AWOLT. Well, if you wanted to say that AWOLT is a criticism of the system and not of individual women, then what you would have to do is show me exactly how women have a disproportionate influence or how they have a disproportionate amount of power in our society. Because from what I can see in terms of the data in places like the UK and the US, women still get a pretty raw deal. I'll leave aside talks of the gender pay gap because that will just get pedantic and it's really boring to talk about after a little while. I'm really not interested in kind of degenerating into bad faith 2015 style arguments around that. But I can still bring up numerous examples of how women are really not in possession of any kind of disproportionate systemic or societal power. Even if I only look at the UK where I live, I can find numerous bits of evidence to back this claim up. For example, women are still vastly underrepresented as leaders in businesses. About 8% of CEOs in FTSE 100 companies, less than 4% in FTSE 250 companies. They are 1/3 of MPs in Parliament, though this is slowly rising. They are less than 22% in the cabinet, and they are 32% of all court judges. It really doesn't seem that women have all that much power, at least in terms of the UK's circle of power. Of course, there is the possibility for some invisible level of influence over the power structures of the world, but that would start to border on conspiratorial, because there's no evidence to back that. So this claim of AWOLT, all women are like that, is either completely fallacious, completely false, or it's simply conspiratorial nonsense. But what about hypergamy? Of course, I've already admitted that hypergamy is in fact a real thing. It's a real sociological, psychological phenomenon. According to studies, about 3 out of 4 women across the world rated socioeconomic status as more important in a prospective marriage partner than did the average man. That is an overwhelming amount of people. That is the vast majority of women who believe that across the entire world. But there are a few things that need to be taken into consideration. Firstly, as far as historical context goes, women did not create this phenomenon. Throughout pretty much all of history, men have been the dominant power across the world. To a large extent, this is still the case. We as men have historically controlled all of the power, all of the influence, all of the politics, all the everything, basically. For most of human history, it was men who decided what culture and society was going to look like. Men always had power over women, and there is a very strong argument to be made that because men had this power over women, there was really no choice but for hypergamy to occur. If you're a woman who cannot really work, who can't really seek any kind of power, any kind of influence, the only way that you are getting that is to marry someone who has it. If you don't have any power of your own, then your best bet, historically speaking, was to marry upwards. Of course, if you like to argue against history, you can, but it would be a very dumb hill to die on. But what about the idea of hypergamy being a biological drive that you can see in terms of evolutionary psychology, how female primates, for example, will seek higher status males, and that if we can see it in primates, then it is a fair conclusion perhaps that it could exist within humans as well. The thing about biological drives is that we override them all the time. Unlike primates, we are conscious to a much, much higher level. We have rationality, we have a much higher level of kind of logic and reasoning capabilities. Secondly, hypergamy, as I stated earlier, is not a one-way system. It exists across kind of multiple planes. For example, the male analog to hypergamy is physical attractiveness. Men typically want to get into relationships with women who are, at least on a comparable scale, more attractive than them. Men also statistically want to be in relationships or marry women who are younger than them as well. If you're a man in your 40s and you want to be in a relationship with a 22-year-old, well, that's your own thing, but you also can't be surprised when you as a 40-year-old with 20 years, into your career are earning way more than a 22-year-old who's just finished university and is in an entry-level job. So it seems like hypergamy isn't something that women force on men. It seems like it's just something that is there. Not only does it seem like men created this entire concept of hypergamy, going back to my historical argument, it also seems like we benefit from it quite a bit, at least in terms of what the average man wants in the average woman, youth and attractiveness. But all of this fails to even answer the bigger question of why does hypergamy even occur in the first place? And the simplest answer is we don't really know. There is no conclusive answer to why hypergamy is. There's biological factors, but those aren't necessarily deterministic. There are other intersecting factors such as culture, society, religion, and a lot more. But we also know that as societies become more equal, this hypergamy gap, if you will, starts to shrink somewhat. For example, it used to be the case that 100% of women were actively marrying up in terms of the power that they had to the power that men had. Every woman did that. And now for the most part, we're down to about 75%. After a few hundred years, that's not bad, bearing in mind, of course, that most of women's rights only came into existence kind of not even like 100 years ago. Who is to say that it won't continue to trend down over time? And if that's the case, then it's not something that we have to actively worry about. We just have to continue making society better and it will fade in time. For example, hypergamy in terms of education is gone. It simply does not exist in any kind of statistically significant way in any country where women have equal access to education as men. It used to be that women would kind of marry up in terms of educational attainment because they couldn't go to school, they couldn't go to college, university, and because of that they tended to marry people who were more educated than them. But once women became more educated through access to education, that gap has essentially disappeared. And if that can happen with education related hypergamy, why couldn't it happen with wealth related hypergamy? The broader point that I am trying to make with all of this is that two of the most foundational factors and elements of the MGTOW philosophy, AWOLT and hypergamy, are either completely untrue or they are on such shaky evidentiary grounds that anyone who prides themselves on being rational and logical and working within reason should look at that and think, this needs further discussion. Maybe I shouldn't just uncritically believe something that somebody told me over the internet. That also goes for what I'm saying here, which is why I will put as many of my citations and evidence in the description as possible. You can go and look at it. And if the MGTOW philosophy is wrong about these fundamentals, then they could just be wrong about everything, or at least most things. And isn't that worthwhile considering. After all, being able to critically analyze your own beliefs is a pretty important part of living as a rational person. Yes, you can still point towards problems like divorce and custody battles. You can point towards men being the overwhelming amount of workplace or military deaths. You can point towards men being the overwhelming amount of suicides, the majority of homeless people. And yes, these are problems that are real and we need to solve them. The world must by necessity become more equal, or we're just going to end up killing each other. I want to solve these problems. Male suicide rates, male homelessness, male workplace deaths, male military deaths. I want to solve these problems. I want them eliminated. But these problems won't go away by simply separating yourself from women and society. MGTOW readily admits that 99% of men will never follow the philosophy. And if that's true, and I believe it is, then you are not going to solve these problems by a few men burying their heads in the sand and separating themselves from society. You're not really solving the problems that your key demographic has. All you're really doing is just kicking that can further down the road and hoping that somebody else will fix it while you go and build a cabin in the woods somewhere. So what is MGTOW? MGTOW is a community of men who have discovered that there are a bunch of problems with society. They have found that there are ways in which even men can be systemically disenfranchised, or even in some cases discriminated against. But they have hastily generalized that these problems come from women, come from feminism, and ultimately they've chosen not to make an effort to improve society, to solve these problems. Instead, they've chosen the Elon Musk approach to societal problems. Run away and hope that the problems never catch up with you. If you actually care about men and their success in the world, then you're going to actually pour your heart and soul into helping them, into solving the problems that you have rightfully pointed out are issues that seem to disproportionately affect men. Instead, most MGTOW followers absolve themselves of responsibility by blaming a fictitious gynocracy and a misunderstanding of hypergamy. This channel is here to help people. My mission is to provide great self-improvement advice and more general advice on how to just make your life better. I want to help men to solve these problems. And I don't think that the MGTOW philosophy and its followers can in good faith say that they want the same things that I do. Thank you very much for watching this video. I know that it's really long. I've been filming for about an hour, so I can only imagine that the eventual video itself is going to be like 40 minutes long or something like that. If you've made it all the way to this point, thank you for bearing with me. If you've got any comments, anything like that, leave them down in the comment section down below. If you like the video, then click the like button as well. If you want to see more content like this, then subscribe to the channel. If you have anything that you think I got wrong, please tell me in the comment section down below. I'm also pretty open probably to debating this because I think that'd be pretty fun. And I love the sound of my own voice. So if that's something that interests you, hit me up. We'll try and set something up, kind of, I suppose. That's basically all I've got. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos on this channel very soon.